Hello, everyone. Welcome again to the Personal Transformation Experience podcast. Our goal in this podcast is to help give people the tools, resources, and information that they need to obtain success and optimal outcomes in all areas of their lives. I'm David Brand.
And I'm Maureen Brand.
And it's a pleasure to have you join us again today. And today we are going to divert significantly from some of the topics that we've been talking about. We spent a lot of time talking about interpersonal relationships, right, communication, emotional intelligence. And today we are going to talk about raising children in the autism spectrum.
Right. Yeah. So this is going to be a series of talks because we're going to discuss from like birth to adulthood. We both have children on the spectrum who are young adults now. And so we raised, obviously we raised our children to adulthood, and there's a lot to cover. I want to start with birth to 3 and maybe 3 to 5 and kind of start with the child.
And just to back up a little bit for everybody, we've been together over 15 years, right, in case you've never watched us before. When we were married, when we met, our children were 4, 5, and 6. Right. We subsequently learned that the oldest and the youngest were on the autism spectrum. And today, those children are 19, 20, and 21.
Right. So we're going to talk about, we're going to start with the child. We're going to talk about brain development, diagnosis to early intervention, emotional dysregulation to meltdowns, the judgment that many parents experience with children with developmental delays or any child with a disability, really, sensory processing, communication, and advocacy, and really what worked, what didn't work, and what we learned along the way.
We've learned a lot.
And we've learned a lot. So we're going to stick to birth to 5, right, for today's talk, because again, it's just a lot to go through.
Yeah. It's been a lot to live through. It's definitely a lot to recap for people too.
Yeah. So just a little background. So my child was diagnosed with autism, ADHD, dyslexia, and anxiety. Many times when you have a child on the spectrum, they have comorbidities, which is just a second sort of diagnosis that a child will have, or an adult. And anxiety is common. ADHD is common. So it was a journey.
And actually, just to clarify once again, I'm sorry I keep interrupting, but I think it's important to note that the 2 children among us, of the 3 that we have that have been diagnosed with autism, are not related to each other.
Correct.
They're each our children from our previous marriages.
Right.
So there's not a biological connection there. So not only do they share a diagnosis of autism, they share a diagnosis of ADHD, they share a diagnosis of anxiety, and at various times depression.
Correct.
The oldest has major depressive disorder. So the only difference, I think, between the 2 of them from a diagnosis standpoint is the dyslexia, which only your child has.
Right, which made it really fun getting her through the school district. So, so there's just a bunch of stuff we want to get through, and we can just start with the brain development. So I'll talk a little bit about this because this is my area. This is what I do for a living.
Maureen is a brain geek.
I am a brain geek,
If you haven't followed us before, she loves all things brain.
All things neuroscience, right. So I think I was a neuroscientist in a previous life.
Well, you kind of need to be, right?
You do. So, but my area is early childhood development. And so I learned a lot along the way and more, because of my child's diagnosis. So the brain, birth to 3. So birth to 3, the human brain is literally a sponge. The brain just absorbs all the information coming in. It doesn't discriminate, and it just keeps absorbing. Every experience it has, it's absorbing and holding on to and keeping, right? And so just know, and then when they turn 3, the brain starts to get a little more efficient and starts to snip away all those experiences that it doesn't use or doesn't have enough of. So again, there is no discrimination. So good, bad, or indifferent, every experience is stored with the child from birth to 3. They're like sponges. And then at 3 years old, around 3 years old, the brain starts to snip away all those, that information or experiences, if you will, that it doesn't use a lot.
Is that what people refer to as pruning?
Snipping.
Snipping.
They're snips,
Okay.
yeah. Pruning, snipping. I'm not sure what the technical term is. You'd have to look up Andrew Huberman, who's Huberman Lab. He's a neuroscientist. He can give you way more information than that. But so that's how I understand it. So it's the greatest learning time in a child's life. It's the biggest growth spurt and learning spurt in a child's life, other than adolescence. Right. Adolescence is the second largest learning spurt of the human developing brain. Yeah, so critical. So it really is a super critical time. So diagnosis. We have many different, so many different stories and so many reactions. And I will tell you, as a parent and a professional, I've seen all different kinds of reactions, and I've been there with many families who got the diagnosis or heard it for the first time. Being in early intervention, I typically would recommend and facilitate the evaluation for the child if I have some red flags that I talk to parents about. So what I will ask you, what was your experience with your child, and when did they finally get diagnosed?
Well, we had relatives in the household that identified behavior that was not typical, what we say is atypical behavior at a very early age. There was a language delay. They were not able to speak clearly or articulate their needs. Mm-hmm. They did a lot of pointing, and we're talking about like around age 2, where children might be saying, hey, I want that, or I want this, or having some language around things. So we couldn't understand what was being said. And like I said, instead of vocalizing a request, there was a finger pointing, right? Mm-hmm. So that was an early sign that a relative picked up on. We had an in-home evaluation, and ultimately my child received in-home services to help with both the language delay and upper body strength and pencil grip and a lot of different issues, or issues with the way they sat in a chair. So they received services. And then
do you remember the services? Like what they were called?
Well, OT.
And
yeah.
Was it just occupational therapy?
Yeah.
I thought it was speech as well.
There was speech in there. I think there was speech in there. Yeah. And those stopped before kindergarten because they were deemed to have progressed enough. So when they got to kindergarten, they weren't receiving those services anymore. Mm-hmm. Still kind of saw those things at home, but there were some internal struggles in the family about accepting that there may be more here. Mm-hmm. And that diagnosis didn't actually come until they were well into their teenage years. Yeah. So there was some delay in receiving some needed services.
Yeah. So this is not uncommon. Typically, it's more common with girls statistically, from what I understand when I look at the research, than boys, because girls, they're harder to diagnose because they tend to mask socially. Masking is a term that many adults and people in the spectrum, who are in the spectrum community, will use when a child goes to school and they have to try to fit in to the larger society and try to make friends. So they mask much of their challenges so that they can fit in. And so
no wonder they end up with depression and anxiety,
mental health,
right?
That's
because
right. That's where the mental health piece comes in.
Right, of trying to be something that you don't feel that you are, or fit in where you don't feel.
Well, they have this push to they not accept it as themselves, so they have to try to be somebody else. Right. And that is definitely a road straight to depression and anxiety, because your body, you should be able to be who you are and express yourself the way you know how. And unfortunately, it's not accepted, especially in elementary school and middle school and even high school. Anything different is typically
and look,
not
I didn't even understand.
Well.
I was in my 40s when I met you, and I didn't understand what autism was.
Right.
I'd heard the term before, and I had some negative connotations in my head about it.
Most people do.
I didn't understand until you educated me on that.
Yeah. I mean, the unfortunate thing is, the majority of people, you would think with all the awareness now that people would know better, but I find that a lot of people don't even know what I'm talking about. And I have to educate them, or I just don't even continue a conversation depending on who it is. It's just, but I will say that, getting a diagnosis, you know, you get everything from tears. People are afraid of the unknown. They are angry. They start trying to blame different things, like, you know, I mean, it's genetic. It's typically a genetic disorder. There's really no other way around that.
People will debate other things.
They'll debate other things,
whether vaccination and so forth, and certainly there's a lot of material out there for and against that type of thing. And we're not here to espouse any particular. We're not here to discuss why a child is autistic, right? Because we have those diagnoses, and we've had to work through it. Right.
So I mean, but you'll get tears and anger and fear and denial and relief. One parent might be in denial and the other one is relieved. One parent is looking, oh my gosh, what's this going to look like in 20 years? And the other parent is usually, what do I do right now? What do I do an hour from now? What do I do tomorrow? Right. Or a week from now? Like they want to know right now what to do. So, I think, you know, that's something that is really tricky when it comes to a family and two people who are married and get this diagnosis. Everybody handles it so differently, and allowing yourself to feel what you need to feel, I would say, my experience, and hopefully be on the same page with your spouse or partner is super critical. You need to get on the same page. So many families don't survive. The marriage doesn't survive. The partnership won't survive because of the differences in opinions about how to handle it, about the diagnosis itself. So I think it's super important. I would say the one thing that I learned is communication with your family, with your partner, with your child, with their care, with their community
research together.
Right. So be on the same page, and if you have differences of opinion about the diagnosis, talk it out. Seek other therapists or other service providers to help you communicate and get on board with what's going on. I mean, get a second opinion if you really are against it. But I will say that, you know, people know, like a parent, most of the families all of the families I've ever had that they've learned about their diagnosis, they knew their gut, they knew something was going on, something wasn't quite right. They didn't want to admit it because it's hard for people to think that their child's anything but perfect. But I will say your child is still perfect, but they're going to be okay. They just have to work on some stuff, just like all of us, right? We all have these flaws.
Yeah, it's not an imperfection. I mean, that's certainly a perspective to take.
Yeah.
It's just that the brain works differently.
Yeah. The brain works very differently. And once you can understand once I was able to understand that my child was experiencing the world vastly different than anybody else, myself, you know, neurotypical peers, just vastly different. And I started to pay close attention to the way that they were experiencing their environment and their surroundings. And I started seeing, okay, I could do this. I can adjust that. I can tweak that. So I just naturally started to accommodate her when she was little. And that just came, you know, and then I learned later, because autism was not on my radar at all. It wasn't. I was just, you know, I think she was two years old when I really started seeing major, like, behavior changes. She wasn't talking. She wasn't pointing. It was hard to get her attention. And she was a picky eater. She would cry, like certain things, you know, she liked to be alone, a lot of solitary time. And so these were all red flags that I didn't.
Yeah. And for mine, it was hearing the hum of a fluorescent light, or hearing the refrigerator running, right? Asking, what is that noise? What is that sound? Right. A sound that really no one else can hear until we were able to pinpoint, oh, you can hear the refrigerator, right? Over how many people can sit there and say, I'm aware of the refrigerator running right now.
Yeah. Some children can hear like the buzz of the fluorescent lights that, you know, especially in schools, it could be very disruptive for that child that's struggling. So, I mean, I would say, if your child can, something like that, these mild sounds are bothering them, you need to take a closer look. It could just be sensory processing disorder or challenges.
Right. That
doesn't have to be a spectrum issue.
Marker for I mean, it's a red flag for autism. It doesn't necessarily mean autism.
Right. Because look, we're all sensory beings, right? We have 5 senses, maybe 6, depending on who you're talking to. But we all have our senses, our, visual. I don't like crowds. I don't like loud noises. I have sensory needs myself. So even if you're neurotypical, though I'm not technically neurotypical because I do have ADHD, every human being has sensory needs. They just, they're not so obvious to the rest of the world because they meet them, they get them met, and they don't even realize they're doing it. So, but other children, especially children on the spectrum, they're a little more like out there, outside the body. So brain development, diagnosis to early intervention. So I would say, as far as a diagnosis goes, if you think something might be going on, the first thing you'd want to do is bring your child to a pediatrician and ask the question. Don't be afraid to say the word autism. I had parents, I know there's some families out there that don't like to label their child, but and I get that, nobody wants to put a label on a child, but it's not who they are. It's what they're challenged with. Right. So,
yeah, it's an explanation.
Yeah, it's an explanation. Right. It's not, you don't have to identify as someone who's, autistic unless you choose to do that. But you are an individual with autism, just like, you might be an individual with diabetes, right? You might be an individual with blue eyes. So this is just describing something about you, and you have some work to do, you have some challenges to overcome. And I think, once a family realizes that it's going to be okay, they can move forward. Progress will show up in fits and bursts. I remember years ago, probably 10, 12 years ago, I was crying literally because my daughter wasn't progressing in school and I was getting upset. And why don't you tell the story, how you showed me the picture of what it looks like? He gave me a visual, which was brilliant because it calmed me right down.
This is why we probably should have a whiteboard for the podcast.
Yeah.
But, I think a lot of people think of development for a child along the lines of a staircase, right? You just keep
not linear. Yeah.
Gradually moving up that staircase. You're gradually just progressing forward. But I think what my experience has been, our experience has been, is sometimes, we've all heard of 2 steps forward, 1 step back, I think, but it's sometimes you go up, sometimes you go in a straight line forward. You're not moving up or down. Sometimes you move down. It's like an erratic path. I think over time there may be changes, but I think it's not what people think of as a typical progression.
So this is what he showed me.
Sometimes
I don't know if you can see that. Can you see that?
It's a little hard to see.
Yeah, it's a little hard to see, but it just kind of goes up, then it's down, then you go backwards, and you take 10 steps forward, and then you might take 10 steps back.
Sometimes you move sideways.
Yeah, all different directions, but progress. You will progress. They will progress. They will eat different foods. They will eventually get potty trained, and they will sleep eventually.
Well, it depends. There is some severe autism, right, that we have not experienced as parents. Those are things that it's just a different measurement.
Yeah, it's a different measurement, right? So I think
we have children that were really
high functioning.
Would describe as high functioning autism, right? So for parents dealing with children with severe autism, they're not able to function in society, not able to work, or that's not something we have experience with.
Yeah, I work with a family whose child has pretty severe autism. He's diagnosed with, he's nonverbal for all intents and purposes. He does have some words. He will sing, but he doesn't communicate with intention. So to get his needs met, there's been progress and then there's been setbacks, but overall he's moving forward. And, I mean, it's been challenging. This family took their child out of school, because school was not helping them. Some schools are helpful and some schools aren't. And it really depends on the teacher, the administration, and the individual school. So
and I think it comes down to defining what success looks like for that child, right? So I know you've worked with children with nonverbal, so immediate success and next step up on that ladder is perhaps saying a word, right? Or saying a few words. But on a grander scale too, it could be maybe accepting that your child is not going to college, maybe never, maybe not right out of high school, right? So some of those things that you thought were going to happen, or going to be typical milestones or whatever, maybe they're not going to happen, or at least maybe not happen on that timetable you might have had in your head.
Right. I mean, look, there's all forms of communication. Verbal is only one of them, right? So pointing, like your child pointed, that's huge. I spend months trying to get a child to point at what they want, point to a picture, point to anything, because it is a form of communication. It's the most basic form, and it indicates what someone wants, right? What a child wants. So getting them to isolate that pointer finger and point to what they want with a picture, because there's picture exchange communication, there's sign language we teach, so there's eye gaze, right? So you ask a child what they want, they look at the picture all the way to the left, it's oranges, they want an orange, right? So you pick up the orange, this is what you want, and usually they'll indicate in some way, either make some kind of vocalization that that's what they want. So, communication is we all start out nonverbal, right? We all start out nonverbal. So think about the infant, right? And how they communicate with their caregivers or parents. They look, they smile, it's gestures, it's pointing, it's hand movement, it's everything.
Right. Well, for a typical infant, right, crying could indicate hunger or needing the diaper change, right?
Right. So you check all, right. So, I mean, that's big. And advocacy. So I will say that, you have a child with autism, your expectation will be that you are going to be advocating for that child for their entire elementary, middle school, and high school career. Yeah. And then you will teach them how to advocate as well, should they be able to do that. And expectations, I would say you maintain your expectation for your child, because if you don't have an expectation that your child's going to succeed and progress, then how could they possibly do that for themselves? So for me, I had to maintain these really high expectations. So even if, your child won't do something or is doing something all the time that you want to change their behavior, there are lots of professional services out there that you can get to help you, ABA services and so forth. But advocacy is huge. We're going to talk more about that probably in another, the next podcast.
That becomes more critical the further they get into the school system.
Well, I would say, I don't know, I would disagree with that. I would say it's critical from day one, because to get your child what they need in services when they're little, because they certainly can't talk to themselves.
Well, it's true. Mine had services at 3, so fair point.
Yeah. You need to be on top of it, and districts will push back a lot. There's a lot of friction, these IEP meetings. I met with a lot of contention. It's very, very challenging and very difficult. So when it's your own child, you are swamped with emotion because you want the best for your child, and the school only cares about providing them an adequate education. And to give them all these services costs a lot of money.
That is the law, actually.
It's the law.
Right? Is that what FAPE stands for?
Free and appropriate public education.
Oh, not adequate.
No, it's appropriate. Just appropriate, right. It doesn't have to be the best.
Not excellent.
Not excellent, although they have these practices for excellent, best practices for excellence in teaching. However, then the law says it needs to be appropriate, whatever's appropriate for them, which kind of, to me, is bare minimum. At least that's how, from my perspective,
that's what it feels like, right?
The school feels like they look. Yeah, it's the honest truth. That's what it feels like. The school just looks at like whatever we can get away with not giving them. That's what we're going to do. I found myself educating educators a lot and bumping into walls because you have these huge egos. Nobody wants to be told how to run their classroom, and they think they know everything, but they don't. So they don't know how to work with your child because they've never met your child before.
Yeah.
So that's, a big deal.
Oh, yeah.
And I ran into that a lot. So that's really frustrating. Let's see. So my husband and I had very different children, both on the spectrum, both with, similar diagnosis, not everything, but talk about opposite ends of that, like a behavior perspective.
Yeah.
My child was very externally, most of her behaviors were external. Yours was internal.
Mm-hmm.
And, but when you're working with providers,
right. No screaming, right. But a lot of internal torment, right? Going
yes.
on. Right? Yours is more, you might have heard the meltdowns and the screaming.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah. Where yours is just crumpled to the ground.
Right.
And not move, but wouldn't talk, like shut down, went inside of himself.
Right.
So, it's very, very different. And, when you work with providers, they're only looking at the external event, meaning the behavior. If you can't observe it, we don't treat it. That's a behaviorist perspective. If you can't observe it, we don't treat it. Like because we don't work with the internal event. We don't know. We can't read their minds, right? You don't know what's going on inside a child's head.
What you can't see can be much more frightening than what you can.
Right. So that's where the family comes in, because they know their child, right? I know my child best, and so you can pretty much tell what your child's feeling and thinking based on the way they're behaving, the way they're looking, their facial expression, the noises that are coming out of the, I knew what she wanted and desired as a parent. So you can tell.
So the parent interview is important as the child interview, right?
Critical.
You can't just take the parent the child out of the room and do a diagnosis. That's why the questionnaire the parents have to complete,
right.
Interviewing the parents is so important,
right?
To make sure that they're sharing their perspective, especially with a child.
Yeah. And with early intervention, you have something called an IFSP, which is the family, service plan. So it's the family service plan. So because the whole family needs to be involved in helping this child.
Right.
So a lot of times I'll go in and I will work with the entire family, or express, have both parents involved. If there's siblings, get the siblings involved and show them and talk to them in, an appropriate way, or help the parents work with their siblings. Because a lot of times if there's a neurotypical sibling and another sibling with autism, the neurotypical one gets frustrated because the one with autism is getting a lot of attention. That happens.
And we had that.
Yep. And so there's a lot of competition and teasing, and within, your household, and every child's so different. And, mine's super sensitive. Not that yours isn't super sensitive, but outwardly we didn't, it was more, they didn't appear super sensitive, even though we know now that they certainly were. So it's interesting how you have to work with that dynamic, and it's not easy. And, it just doesn't come with a handbook.
No.
Right.
No, and every child is as different as a snowflake or a fingerprint.
Right. Exactly. So, and you never know, as children grow, so do their needs, their sensory processing needs, their communication needs. Everything changes as they grow. So what might have been something that worked well for them, at 3 or 4 is not going to work well for them at 5 and 6. So it's constantly changing, just like any human developing is going to change. But children on the spectrum don't experience the world the same way. Their brains are extremely different. They're just not processing their environment in any of the way that you think they are. So you have to ask a lot of questions. You have to really, I love data. So I would actually take data. So I took this ABC data. It's you do the before, during, and after the behavior. So you want to pay close attention to the antecedent, or what happens before, which we can get into later. But once you realize what might trigger your child into having a meltdown, typically, you learn to become hypervigilant as proactive as possible. And if not, you need to learn certain things. Like you can't say no to a child. You don't discipline a child. I will tell you, you do not discipline a child on the spectrum.
And what we're not saying is
Hands
not
down.
to have structure.
Right. That's not to say you don't say no. You have boundaries, but you can't just say, no, you can't do that to a child on the spectrum, because that doesn't work. You have to do what works. So you could say yes after you get dressed. Yes, after you eat dinner, you can have this. Mom, can I have that? Absolutely. As soon as you're done with this, right? So it's called a first then approach. Yes, and. So you want to make sure you have to give them some agency too, right? So if you tell them 15 minutes and then we're going to be done with this activity and they want 5 more or they want a few more minutes. I did this a lot with my own child because they feel so out of control. And I was questioned a lot about you're spoiling them, you're letting them get. No, I'm trying to provide them with some agency so they feel like they have some control. You want 5 more minutes? Sure. So I would tell them a half hour before they needed to stop, I would tell them you have 15, 20 more minutes. And then they would say, because I would anticipate, Mom, can I have 5 more minutes? Sure, you have 5 more minutes. So now I know, because I'm giving myself extra time to provide that for them.
Right, you're building it in.
I'm building it in. So, and that's what you learn. You learn that you realize you're super creative. So,
yeah, it's kind of like, when they advise you when you're driving a car and you hit a patch of ice, you steer into the skid, right? You're kind of doing that in a way too.
Yeah.
Right.
But it takes time to really learn that that's what you need. I wasn't always like this. I can't tell. I'm as a human being, you lose your shit. You can only take so much. And then you're just like, in the stress of everything else that was going on.
Right. And then compound that with people looking at the situation going, why are you letting your kid get away with that?
Right. Well, did you try this? Did you try that? You just want to strangle her, scream at everybody to shut up and mind their business because they're not helping. Right. So, and that's what's really frustrating. People love to give people advice when they have no idea what's going on, So I remember I had a nurse say to me one time, because Finn freaked out and she ran into another part of the clinic and was hiding under a bed because she was scared. The nurse was like, it's a good thing she's not my kid. Right. I looked at her, I was like, yeah, good fucking thing. I was so mad. I took my kid and just walked out.
Yeah.
Because, how do you say that to a parent? It's a good thing she's not my kid. That's when I started realizing, thank God she is my kid. Thank God. So, yeah. What else do we want to, what's next? So, expectations, expect progress. So I would ask you, what are your experiences with those kinds of things, being out in public and struggling to understand how to handle your kid when they were just crumpling to the floor?
Certainly I felt embarrassment.
Yeah.
And shame, like I didn't know what to do and I didn't know how to gain control. And I will say there's things that happen now where I feel like I'm not really sure what exactly I need to do here in this situation. Yeah. And that's okay. And I think we still have to hold ourselves accountable to try and figure that out. But I think we also have to show ourselves some grace in those moments too. And just acknowledge. And maybe I said out loud to somebody, I'm just doing the best I can right now in this moment. And certainly acknowledge that. And I think one of the things you've talked to me about is realizing that the child themselves is not intentionally or unintentionally giving other people a hard time.
Yes.
They're having a hard time. And I think when you shift your perspective and when you see, and I have a whole different perspective right now, when I see somebody, I went through security at an airport last month.
My goodness.
And the person that was checking me checking my ID was shouting and was rotely repeating the same thing to everybody. License out, face to the camera, move to the right, over and over again and shouting it.
Right.
And I realized, okay, most likely this person has autism.
Yeah.
Or when I see a child screaming and melting down, I say this child has autism. Even I think about, I'm old enough to remember when the principal came in and spanked a child in the first grade in front of the class. Because I've had people say to me, well, there weren't as many autism diagnoses as 50 years ago.
No, well.
And you can have all kinds of reasons why you believe that something is the cause for that. But I personally believe that we didn't know how to diagnose autism like we do today. And so you had a child that was misbehaving, was screaming in class, acting out in class, tics, whatever. They just got spanked, and it was addressed as that's a behavior issue. And if we just spank them, that'll teach them not to behave like that again. But usually the same kid was getting spanked over and over again, right? So it wasn't working, right?
No.
And so
Doesn't work.
I think even today,
just traumatizes the child.
Feel like, well, that kid needs a spanking. I've read things like, well, we need to go back to spanking. So, this idea that they need more discipline, right? And the problem is more discipline. And what I feel that people need is more understanding.
Right.
Right. The parent's doing the best job they can. The child is likely doing the best job that they possibly can do in that moment. And just working with that. Right. And the other thing is not worrying so much about what people think, right? When your child is melting down, and maybe you always want to make sure your child is safe, right? So if they're in a situation where they're not safe, and I think you've encountered that, you do have an obligation to make sure that they're safe, right? We can't let them have a meltdown in a way that's going to put their safety or others in jeopardy. Yeah.
A lot of times children on the spectrum, they have an anxiety disorder, usually not diagnosed quite yet, because their amygdala is on, overtime, is working overtime. The amygdala is the part of the brain that works with emotion, fight or flight. And I will tell you that my child was always in fight or flight mode. And they were a runner. And they ran out of school several times. I'd been requesting an aid for them.
And that's dangerous.
And it's dangerous. So they ran out of school. And finally I was like, okay, so either you get my child an aid, or you're going to be talking to my lawyer soon, because, you can't keep my child within the school, just, inside the school grounds, because she would get upset or freaked out, or, it's very hard for a child on the autism spectrum to function in school. Yeah. There's so much, sensory input, and, she can't do multiple, even today, they're not able to handle more than one or two directions at a time.
Right.
They
get overwhelmed easily.
Very quickly. So we accommodate that, right? They know how to accommodate that now, because they'll just do one thing at a time or make a list, right? So if someone needs to do something, if they have to do something, they make a list.
So I think that's a good segue for a future episode, because one of the things that we'd committed to was keeping these episodes a little bit shorter than we've been doing in the past, because we're going over a lot of information here, and we certainly encourage people to reach out to us and ask us questions, ask for resources. We're going to share those resources in this podcast. But,
yes, I have tons of resources.
I think we're getting to a good point where we could leave off for next week talking about these strategies, right?
Yes.
School, getting through school, trying to do too many things at once, right? Giving too many directions at once, doing too much at once. So I think this is a good place to kind of leave it, right? And we'll, I think, pivot next week to talking about those. How do you accommodate having a child with autism? I think we covered high level, right, about going through the diagnosis. The next thing is, okay, you have a child, your children, in our case with autism. How do you go about the business of life and getting that education, right?
Yeah.
What are the accommodations you seek and manifest? Right.
And I want it real quick. I watched a YouTube podcast with this gentleman named Orion Kelly. He's called That Autistic Guy. He's from Australia. And he interviewed this woman who's from the States. She's mom on the spectrum. Yeah. Both of these adults, parents, are autistic. They've both been diagnosed with autism spectrum, and they both parent children who are also on the spectrum. Yep. So fascinating, incredible, humbling listening to these two talk about their parenting experiences. Yeah. So we're going to talk more about that next time. I have a ton of resources for everyone. And I'm going to post those in the show notes. And so we will definitely come back next week, meet us back here next week, and we'll talk about all that stuff because I'm really excited. There's so much to go over.
We're very passionate about the topic. You're obviously very passionate about the topic. So we're very excited to continue this conversation with everybody next week. So again, if you have any comments, if you like what you heard today, please share the video with others. Please
anything you want to ask, questions, I've been doing this for
and please follow us.
Well over 2 decades. So definitely follow us, subscribe, and stay tuned.
All right. Thank you. Have a good week.
Okay. Bye.